The year is 2004. Nintendo launches their new handheld system, the Nintendo DS, which quickly takes the gaming world by storm. A simple and easy-to-use touchscreen, combined with a mixed library of both casual and challenging games, brought about a new era of gameplay experiences not possible before. All of a sudden, relatively simple games like Mario had to exist on two screens instead of one, and be touch interactive too. Many games had to be designed and redesigned with the DS's specific hardware in mind. Game genres made popular by console gaming found themselves incompatible with the DS's new and strange control scheme, which allowed for more niche games to flourish in the mainstream where hardcore titles once dominated. Visual novel games are a game genre that feature a heavy emphasis on storytelling through use of text and character dialogue. The DS had tons of them, and it's easy to see why. They could be enjoyed by players of any skill level, and they didn't require much commitment per play session. It only made sense to have games comprised mostly of reading on an already book-shaped system. Many visual novel games on the DS made use of the touchscreen as a means for solving puzzles and writing down clues. While there are some visual novel games on the DS that use the touchscreen in interesting ways, oftentimes the features added by the bottom screen are not necessarily features at all and could have been replaced by button presses instead. A key example of this comes from the Ace Attorney trilogy on DS, which were actually ports of single-screen Game Boy Advance games. Because of this, for the majority of the Ace Attorney trilogy, the bottom screen was relegated to one giant button that advances text. The games make so little use of the bottom screen that modern ports of the Ace Attorney games have gone back to being single-screen games with little to no hiccups. In fact, a lot of DS-exclusive visual novel games have made the jump to being single-screen rather successfully. Well, that is all except for one. 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors is a visual novel game for the DS that only works on the DS. Released in 2009 by developer Chunsoft, 999 uses the DS's top and bottom screen in tandem to tell the game's narrative in a way that directly involves the player and challenges their connection to the game's world. This game is all about breaking the fourth wall and subverting player expectations. If you like comparisons, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors is basically the Metal Gear Solid of the visual novel genre. In 999, the player takes control of Junpei, a Japanese college student who, while relaxing at home one night, is ambushed and kidnapped by a mysterious gas-masked man. The man tells Junpei that he's been selected to take part in what he dubs the Nonary game. After blacking out, Junpei wakes up to find himself confined within the bowels of a ship with a strange watch-like device on his hand. Upon exiting the room he's trapped in, he comes across 8 other people with the same watches as him. Over an intercom, the gas-masked man, known as Zero, explains what's going on. He has kidnapped Junpei and the others, and imprisoned them within an exact replica of the Titanic. Their goal? To find the ship's exit within 9 hours before the ship sinks. While the story is about Junpei, each other player in the Nonary game has their own unique personalities and quirks. One of the other people Zero kidnapped is Akane, Junpei's childhood friend, who he hasn't seen since elementary school. Another important abductee is Ace, a mysterious older man who seems to know more than he's letting on. It's up to the player to guide Junpei and his friends to safety and uncover the greater conspiracy behind the Nonary game and Zero's identity. What makes 999 stand out from other visual novels on the DS is its unique use of the dual-screen setup. During gameplay, the top screen shows character dialogue, while the bottom screen features accompanying narration. This narration will often add qualifying details to the environment or character emotions that can't be expressed purely through text or the design of the sprites. In order to talk about the game's use of dual screens, we're going to have to look at game interfaces, what they are and how they function. In 2012, Steven Manenberg from the University of California wrote a paper called Translation and as Interface, which analyzed and defined the concept of video game interfaces. In it, he refers to Nick Monfort and Ian Bogost's 5-layer model of platform studies. Each layer of this model represents a component that makes up the whole of a video game. Manenberg draws special attention to interface as a component for games. As he puts it, interface can be either haptic or visual. It can be both the controllers that the player uses to interface with the platform and the graphical user interface or heads-up display displayed on the screen that allows the player to interpret the game form. Mandenberg identifies three major types of game interfaces: the visual or graphical interface, which consists of what the player sees on screen, such as menus; the haptic or control interface, which takes the form of the hardware being used to play the game; and the translation interface, which for games that originate from other cultures involves the translation and localization processes. In 999, the main control interface is that of the DS's touchscreen. It's how the players make decisions, solve puzzles, and interact with other characters. But it's used for more than just that. To explain exactly what I mean, I'm going to have to spoil the game's ending, so be aware, spoilers ahead. To understand the extent of 999's interface with the player and the overall story of the game, one needs to understand the concept of morphogenetic fields. You see, much like in Metal Gear Solid, this game also loves spicing up its narrative with real-world scientific concepts. Whereas in Metal Gear it was Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, in this game it's Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory. Rupert Sheldrake is a British parapsychologist, someone who studies psychic abilities and other phenomenon, who in 1981 wrote a book titled A New Science of Life. In it, he describes morphic resonance as being the idea that humans, and all other species, have a sort of shared collective memory with each member of its own species through morphogenetic fields. Taken from Sheldrake's website, he says, "Through morphic resonance, the patterns of activity in self-organizing systems are influenced by similar patterns in the past, giving each species and each kind of self-organizing system a collective memory." To prove this idea that species have collective memories, Sheldrake conducted a number of experiments. In one experiment, he had two sets of rats from different parts of the world each eat pieces of food that were poisoned. Supposedly, the rats would eventually refuse to eat the poisoned food, even if they had never seen the food before. Sheldrake claims that the rats who ate the poisoned food and died were able to transmit telepathic signals over morphogenetic fields that influenced the decisions in the other rats not to eat the poison. Essentially, as soon as enough members of a species learn something, that thing starts to become a subconscious knowledge in others. The developers of 999 were heavily inspired by Sheldrake's theory and designed much of the game's narrative and structure around it. While in real life, morphic resonance theory isn't highly regarded, in the world of the game, Sheldrake is mentioned constantly and his theory is essentially taken as fact. So how exactly did morphic resonance theory influence the game's design? First, let's talk about the game's narrative. Games have a variety of narrative structure types they utilize in order to convey the game's story to the player. In traditional fiction, the narrative structure goes as follows. You have a beginning, a rising conflict, a climax, and then a conclusion. Video games are different in that their stories are not always linear and are often heavily influenced by player interactions with games. In 999, for instance, the narrative has a number of possible endings, with only one being the correct ending. The book Understanding Video Games mentions one Marie-Laure Ryan, who created 9 fundamental narrative structures video games can utilize. Here, we can see that 999's story flowchart almost exactly matches the tree structure diagram. However, this flowchart doesn't present the full picture of the game's narrative. 999 has an interesting way of handling bad endings not seen in other games. In most games, bad endings are considered non-canon, meaning that in the overall story they didn't really happen. This is not the case in this game. You see, unbeknownst to Junpei himself, he is subconsciously able to tap into morphogenetic fields and use them to gain new information. The long and short of it is, Junpei is able to essentially read the player's thoughts. This is what the text at the beginning of the video was about, which is the first thing players see when starting the game. Everything the player learns and discovers, Junpei also learns. In one bad ending, the player learns Ace is the game's main antagonist, and when starting the game again, Junpei seems to subconsciously distrust him, because, well, the player distrusts him. By piecing together clues from the game's bad ending, the player is able to learn the secrets needed to unlock the game's true end. Speaking of the true ending, this is where the secret behind the game's narration starts to be revealed. In the game's true ending, it's revealed that the Nonary game is actually the second in a series of games. The creator of the original Nonary game is Ace, who became obsessed in proving the existence of morphogenetic fields and their compatibility with humans. 9 years before the game's current events, he and a number of other benefactors kidnapped local children and set them aboard a Titanic replica much similar to the one the main characters are now stuck on. One of the children kidnapped in this original experiment was Junpei's friend Akane, where she was killed in a freak accident. Before dying, however, she was able to use morphogenetic fields to communicate with Junpei 9 years in the future. Her voice is represented through the game's narration on the bottom screen, which guides both Junpei and the player through the game's story. Each screen essentially represents each of the characters' point of view as they go through the exact same events 9 years apart. In the final puzzle, the game is turned on its head when the player switches characters from Junpei to Akane by literally flipping the DS upside down and using the bottom screen as the top screen. This moment has always stuck with me because it's something that couldn't be replicated on any other system. Only on the DS could a narrative twist like this be possible, but that's not to say they didn't try. To close off this video, I'd like to return back to Mandenberg and translation and as interface. Like Mandenberg says, games have many types of interfaces that all come together to create the whole experience of playing. Translation as interface is one he focuses on specifically, being the translation of a game from one region or culture to another, and how it can change the game experience. Games have always been undergoing translation, whether that be from one region to another or from one system to the next. What happens when a game specifically designed for certain hardware finds itself on different hardware? How does that translation happen, and what does it mean for the game as a text? As much as I'd recommend playing 999 on original hardware, I know that's increasingly becoming less possible. The way most people played 999, and the way I first played it, was through the 2017 HD port of the game to PC. While the port is a serviceable way to experience the game, the charm of its original premise is lost. Taking a 2-screen game and shrinking it down to one forced the developers to make a number of tough choices. One of them being, do they include the narration or not? They seem to have remedied this by letting the player choose between playing with or without it. It's too bad because most players, including me, when first playing, assumed the narration was unnecessary to read and just left it off. Because of this, the game's story made much less sense than it otherwise would have. With Nintendo shifting away from portable consoles to focus on the Switch, it makes me wonder what the fate of my favorite DS and 3DS games will be. Will there ever be another system like the DS? Or another game like 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors? How can future consoles truly utilize their hardware in ways that make games interactive and engage the players through more than just the controller? Games have come and gone, and for the most part, the standard controller has had its design solidified. It seems like the days of experimentation are mostly behind us. While the Xbox and DualShock controllers might be the standard today, I'll never forget the time a DS game genuinely made me cry by playing upside down Sudoku.